Hello, my name is Alex, and I am the host of How Bizarre Podcast, and this is episode 9 of the series. Hopefully you'll like it, and the show will make some traction in the time ahead. So, what is this podcast about? It's about storytelling, and especially about stories that are obscure, unknown to the wider public, strange and sometimes inexplicable, content that somehow never got the attention it deserved. Stories that are forgotten in the mists of time, regardless if they happened yesterday or some centuries ago. So if you are attracted to bizarre, shocking, or just plainly weird stuff, I think you'll find this podcast very informative and perhaps even entertaining. This podcast is for mature audiences, and listener discretion is advised. All that being said, now let us dive into the 9th episode of How Bizarre Podcast. The first memorial to Somalia evokes unpleasant feelings, conditioned by the beautiful film Black Hawk Down. The footage of jeeps dragging corpses of American Marines on the streets, the inevitable children with bloated bellies and eyelashes infested by flies, pirates who, like their predecessors 300 years ago, fill the headlines of the world press. Throw in some runaway Islamists for a good measure and you get general lawlessness. But even so, Somalia exists in the collective vocabulary of the first world. Where do you think you are? Somalia is not an unheard of sentence. In that collective mind, Africa consists of Egypt, because of the pyramids, South Africa, because of the apartheid, Zimbabwe, because of the name of that country that people somehow find funny, Nigeria, because of soccer, and Somalia. Oh yes, and that country where there was genocide. Whatever its name was. But that is another story. As one has noticed in an attempt to be witty, Somalia is the real-life answer to Mad Max. Maybe it's a black Bubba Zanetti on the shores of the Indian Ocean who replaced the motorcycle with a boat. What is certain is that most of the land of the territory formerly known as Somalia is stateless. The state of Somalia originated in the territory that was Italian Somalia and British Somaliland, with decolonization as an antithesis of scramble for Africa. The ex-colonies later merged into one British colony, which in the wake of the Declaration of Independence in the late 1950s became an independent state itself. From 1960 to 1969, pro-Western despots ruled the country, and in 1969, after a bloody coup, Marxist by the name of Mohammed Syed Barre crawled out of the woodwork and seized power. Eastern European aid followed, several wars with neighbors and domestic traitors alike, famine, misery, corruption, Bob Geldof, white uniforms and medals on the chest of the president for life, and in January 1991 an uprising broke out. Uprising in which various clans united to overthrow the regime. With communism falling apart worldwide, there was no support for Syed Barre and his regime collapsed quickly. But here an unexpected turn occurred because the uprising wasn't just about overthrowing the regime but also overthrowing the state as an entity. The leaders of some of the larger clans tried to establish state power for themselves, but it all ended in failure, and the power usually extended to several districts of Mogadishu and nothing more. Any attempt to establish central government was met with armed resistance. A civil war broke out in an attempt not only to exploit the power vacuum but also to restore the state. The restoration was forced by the UN, which immediately sent blue helmets to the field, a heavily armed force set to establish a state. United Nations endeavor eventually ended ingloriously and troops were withdrawn after heavy losses, including the famous Black Hawks and Pakistani tanks. Local militias humbled UN forces, humiliated US troops, and drove away Pakistani, Malaysian, and Italian contingents. After 5 years of war and the withdrawal of foreign troops and their support for the favored clans, relative peace lasts from 1996 to 2006. Somalia disappeared from the press and television, and no ruler's motto in Somalia stabilized the territory. Anarchy all over Somalia. Of course, stability is not for sale. Who wants to read and look for peace in the Horn of Africa? Does not everyone know that there grow some strange biological units, Evolutionary freaks. At the first mention of the term Somalia, unpleasant feelings are aroused, in part because it once belonged to the crown. One state is restored, the Republic of Somaliland, that retains the framework to be full member of international community but remains unrecognized by the outside world. That is because UN is staunchly determined that Somalia needs a central government with the borders set by the British and Italian colonizers. The larger part of Somalia, known as Italian East Africa in the past, is where anarchy grows. And yet, no ruler's concept must be crashed by statists. In 2006, after a decade of prosperity, there was a rise of Islamists, backed by Saudi petrodollars. In this case, it is difficult to talk about Islamists of the Taliban rank, more about Islamists who want dollars, alcohol, drugs and expensive jeeps, maybe even rock and roll, although I would not dare to suggest such a thing fearing a fatwa on my head. But even as they managed to establish control over much of Somalia. This includes Ethiopia, which is sending troops and aviation against the Islamists, backed by the United States and the United Nations, who are trying to re-establish the idea of a state through the cannons of the Abyssinian army. Yes, Ethiopia of all the countries. There is also a patriotic charge in that. The battle for Ogaden, when the Marxist comrades Mengistu Mariam and Syed Barre sent an army to slaughter each other for several kilometers of dust. Bye-bye anarchy. The state and religion are returning to, quote, save the people, unquote. 8 years of new low-level civil war followed, with several oases where certain clans of pagan origin remain out of chaos. More than a dozen attempts to reinstate the state failed miserably because once people taste freedom, there's no coming back. After the fall of anarchy, the coast of Somalia became interesting for fishing companies from various countries, including Japan. Huge fishing factory ships were depleting the fish stock on a scale never seen in human history, on which the survival of hundreds of thousands of coastal inhabitants depends. Faced with hunger, people turned to reviving a forgotten craft celebrated by Robert Louis Stevenson's novels, piracy. The pirates are achieving spectacular results, from conquering Saudi tankers to Liberian or Bahamian-flagged cargo ships carrying tanks and missiles from ex-Soviet countries to random clients, most of whom were African despots. Boo-hoo-hoo. The world was allegedly horrified and directed serious naval forces to end piracy. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the feeder for the Suez Canal, is close by, and endangering such a sea route is a crime against modern corporatism. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yoho and a barrel of oil. It is certain that the number of pirate attacks has decreased with the interventions, and hunger reigns supreme along the coastline. 10 years is not a small amount of time for a human being. And 10 years of anarchy for a geographical area almost twice as large as United Kingdom, although sparsely populated with no more odd 13 million people in the time when anarchy was present, raised my eyebrows a bit, to say the least. A land, previously eaten up by wars, corruption, famine, epidemics and tyranny. Who knows? Whatever it would be, the anarchy is still present in at least half of the land, if not more even now, 16 years after the invasion. Hope comes to the surface again. Even today there is only a shadow of a central government that rules 2 cities and nothing more. There are also Islamists who want to change the deity of the state with the deity of Allah. Both options are only seemingly opposite because they are very similar in essence. Both are dependent on the deity called dollar. Both are funded by taxpayers' money across 7 seas, many of whom have never heard of Somalia. It is an inexhaustible source, and they will continue to pay, until the last fighter against the state and Allah falls dead, from a bullet, famine or disease, whatever. The most unlikely symbol of freedom fighter is a Somali peasant dressed in rags with his venerable AK-47 or RPG. One can only hope that the people of former Somalia find a way to restore liberty and to throw away religious and secular rulers once and for all. If you want to know more, Please try the book Better Off Stateless by Peter Leeson, capital work on the subject by a man who was there many times and writes not only by personal experience but also with all manner of statistics which present a picture of Somalia being much better place compared with rest of Africa. Another excellent jaw-dropping book is Masters of Poverty by Graham Hancock, who writes about the gargantuan corruption in the charity industry and the UN and what those entities did to Somalia before 1991 and the uprising. Third and final proposal will be detailed study by group of 3 British journalists who flew there and saw a vibrant and steady economy and upon arrival in Britain made the said study by the name Somalia after state collapse, chaos or improvement. They have my deepest admiration, so I wholeheartedly recommend them. I hope you all liked episode 9 of this podcast. Thank you so kindly for listening and I will be back next time for episode 10 of the How Bizarre podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, sharing, and above all, subscribe to this channel, dear listener. Because, why not? Join me next time for another bizarre adventure through space and time. Cheerio.